today on this. But so because of this, I ended up kind of condensing into one discussion, something I wanted to share into two discussions. You guys will see the part that is rushed. But the good thing is that the part that is rushed refers to one text. So if you guys want to see it fully fleshed out and slowly developed, you can just read like 15 pages. It's dense stuff, but not that dense. It's quite readable. And then there is a doctorate dissertation on it, which is very slow and kind of step by step if you want the like expanded kind of version. But all of that to say that there will be a part that I think it will end up being a bit more compressed, even though you will probably see it's probably the part we should be pushing forward, but it's also the more technical numbers and letters start to appear and arrows. So perhaps it's okay to have it a bit condensed for today. Okay, I guess it's everyone who thought who would join us here already, right? Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah?
Yeah.
I think there is a bit of a delay, no?
Yep.
Shit.
The audio is good, but the video is laggy.
Yeah, the video is lagging behind a bit, shows freezing from time to time.
Okay, let me see if this makes it better. Okay, guys, we'll see. If you guys think it's kind of weird, let me know. I can restart my computer. We can try again a bit. Perhaps this makes it better. I don't know. Okay. Can you guys read the screen? Yeah. Okay, so my idea for today, as I said, it's a bit compressed because the original plan was to stop here in the first meeting and then do these two in a second meeting. So we're actually going to go a bit quicker at the end, but perhaps I can pick it up afterwards. I know Dennis is presenting some stuff that might be useful to try to integrate later on. Either way, it's not like it was a total kind of detour last time when we discussed this this diagram here, right? We spent a long time going over it and different ways of understanding it. By the way, I think Franz is trying to... Let me make somebody a co-host just so... You can bring other people in if needed. So yeah, so we spent a long time in this little diagram last time, right? And I tried to propose, I mean, this is one of the first ideas we had that were used a long time ago to describe perhaps how we could think about political organization mediating the relation between people and the social world. And then I had the idea of dividing these three arrows here to help us think, why would it be better to look at the world through a political organization rather than look at it straight as you try to conceptualize it, right? And the idea that I found was to propose that, well, the political organization is a more interesting path when this upper path here is different from this lower path here, right? So the way you see the world on your own is different from the way you see it going this upper path, but you could actually use this difference in two sides. I think it's something that we discussed last time, right? You could talk about, let's say, well, you can mediate yourself through some very poorly expressive ideology that puts everything into very small boxes, and actually thinking on your own is more expressive than thinking through that mediation, which is more reductive. Or it can be the opposite. Thinking through that mediation is more expressive and sees more or sees something different than your direct relation. And I think that we explored those two ideas, right? When ideology seems to restrict, and when you have this other form of mediation that seems to allow you to think things you wouldn't think on your own, right? And that idea of thinking things you wouldn't think on your own, I think it's very much the topic, and trying to flesh that out and trying to find more concepts to deal with that. That's the topic we're going to be seeing today. So another drawing that I had last time was one where we had this little triad here, which has nothing to do with this one, right? It's just this more conceptual idea that when you know how things are composed, you understand what becomes intelligent, what makes a difference to that system, and what it gets to interact with. And I think we've done some work mostly on this part here. So looking at social worlds in terms of this, of how it's composed, what makes a difference, and what gets to interact with what, and the same for social mediations, but the relation between agents, individual agents, and social mediations, particularly something I personally still didn't have much clue of how to go about thinking this displacement, right? So this idea of extended mind, which is something that it's actually kind of a competitive, a current hypothesis in the field of cognitive science and philosophy of mind and so on, was first presented in a text, I think it's from '98 by David Chalmers and Andy Clark, right? And so my idea for today is to start first discussing what they call this extended mind thesis, how they argue it, which I think is quite important to understand. Then understand the development that a guy called Sean Gallinger did on top of it, trying to expand how they approach this from more prosthetic, technological kind of descriptions, which is what they were mostly interested in, like notebooks, computers, like things like that, as extensions of your mind. And these guys try to think, okay, but why couldn't social practices and institutions be an extension of that? But that creates a lot of strange paradoxes. And then a guy called Mark Slors, he tried to categorize the different options in the field of extended minds. Like he comes up with 4 different types of extensions or ways of thinking about this sort of extended cognition. So that's point 3. I thought of stopping there at first because it kind of is a closed topic, but I really wanted to introduce this 4th point, which is something I've been informally talking about for a while. Didn't have a chance to kind of delve into it, but it is the work of a very famous logician called John Barwise. I think another guy, a Spanish logician called Echemedi, and this Japanese guy called Shimojima, who did his doctorate thesis with Barwise. And they try to, I mean, they don't really enter in dialogue that much with the extended mind people, but they try to give an account of why some problems are better solved through other means than your head, and why there are differences between solving, math kind of calculations with pen and paper, or with a calculator, or with an abacus. Like, why are these different representations of the problem more suited for some problems than others, right? So the name of Shimojima's thesis is really beautiful, is on the efficacy of representation. So what makes a representation efficacious more than another one? And then we just have here at the end some attempts, very brief, at reintroducing all of this into the ongoing discussions we've been having. So hopefully, if we get all the way to 4, I think it's enough. But I'll try to go kind of quick. I think that there's a lot of stuff that it's perhaps a bit over-explained, and perhaps we can get to it a bit quicker. But you guys let me know. So I think the first point to get this extended mind thesis is to understand what Chalmers and Clark called active externalism, which is the position they're trying to argue. And it's a position that is trying to state something with regards to this famous question, where does the mind stop and the rest of the world begin? And they say, well, some people accept the boundaries of skin and skull and say that the outside the body is outside of the mind. Others are impressed by arguments suggesting that the meaning of our words just end in the head, and hold that this externalism about meaning carries over into an externalism about mind. And they want to pursue a third position, which is neither saying the mind is in your body, nor saying, well, the mind is almost like a linguistic construct. It's more attached to the word I than to anything inside you. And they want to advocate a third thing, which they call active externalism. And I think, though, if I understood it correctly, I think these are the 3 drawings we could have, which is, one thing is you're constantly inside your mind, and the external world, this is, let's say, very, very weak externalism. The world only enters the mind, let's say, to give you a signal if you're in the right direction, the wrong direction. It comes at the end of all the workings of the mind, right? It just marks the boundary in a way. It's more like response to something you're doing. There is this kind of strong externalism, but it's still passive in a certain sense, where everything is in the world, and the idea that there is an inside is almost like a byproduct, for example, of a linguistic construct that is stable enough to have always the reference to the same kind of I. And the third thing, which is the thing that they're interested in, is the idea that it's not that there is the feedback structure, the reflexive structure is inside the world or inside the mind, but it goes from the mind to the world and back to the mind. And that these 2 things together form the composite system of the mind proper, right? So you can have cognitive capacities that are connected to your brain, but the external world is not just responding passively to you or something like the shell, and your brain is the active part of the mind, but that external is actually inside the feedback, the self-reflexive feedback of what you then would call your mind. So it's very specific to this whole debate about philosophy of cognition and so on. Definitely not that well versed in this to probably contextualize it properly. I know Putnam and others have are more classically externalists in another sense, and then there are people like Searle who will say this makes no sense, but I can't really reconstruct this debate for you guys. But I think it's interesting that just having that idea that there's something that goes out, the external world is playing an active role in the definition of what the mind is, right? I think there are some interesting precursors to this. For example, this is Gregory Bateson in 72. He writes, suppose I'm a blind man and I use a stick. I go tap, tap, tap. Where do I start? Is my mental system bounded at this handle of the stick? Is it bounded by my skin? Does it start halfway off the tip of the stick? But these are nonsense questions. The stick is a pathway along which transforms of difference are being transmitted. The way to delineate the system is to draw the limiting line in such a way that you do not cut any of these pathways in ways which leave things inexplicable, right? So it's a kind of a relational idea where if to understand the ongoings of this thing, I need to constantly consider how it interacts with this thing. Cutting the system here and analyzing it this way will leave some things inexplicable. So probably I should expand it and treat this thing as its unit. But in a certain sense, the joints of nature, as Plato would say, you have, let's say, points of very strong pathway connections and points of very weak. And you could say methodologically, you should try to cut your systems at the point of weak connection. So In a certain sense, you have the guy walking and he's holding a stick, and what he taps might be important, but perhaps, you know, the fact that below the street there are pipes going through, or the air around him, perhaps you can cut it only at him and the stick, and that's a good unit because all the other connections are very weak and barely nothing is left inexplicable about what interests us if we cut it that way, rather than, you know, cutting it only on his body, for example. So again, it's an argument about the boundary of the mind, and arguing that there should be almost like a methodological reason to cut the system of the mind in such a way that you include all the pathways of, you know, response and active interaction that are required to explain the whys of what's going on. It's still very loose, and I mean, you could, the whole extended mind thesis is currently being kind of criticized for bloating cognition too much. Like, okay, but then everything is cognition. Thank you very much. Like, okay, what do we do now? Where do I put the boundary? And what is the, let's say, more, you guys end up not answering the question, what is the nature of cognition? You're just telling us its boundary is not where we thought, but we never get to understand what's the mark. So it's still also very, this previous formulation by Bateson is also a bit nebulous, but you guys get that feeling of, okay, there is something out that we would, in the first glance, consider outside, but it's so integrated with the system of why things happen and how they happen that it probably, you shouldn't put the boundary just as the limits of the skin by definition, right? There's a question there. So they continue, and you can see that there's a similar feel here. They say, in the cases we describe, the relevant external features are active. They play a crucial role in the here and now. It's not like the reference to the external world is important, or that the external world kind of confirms all your constructions at the end of a process. They are playing a crucial role as you go, like tap, tap, tap of the stick. Because they're coupled with the human organism, they have a direct impact on the organism and its behavior. In this case, the relevant parts of the world are in the loop, not dangling at the other end of a long causal chain. It's concentrating on this sort of coupling that leads us to an active externalism. I added here something which I find amazing, is that if you go to 1890, so Freud writing a project for a scientific psychology, a text that he was embarrassed. He wrote, it's the only systematic attempt at describing the logic of psychoanalysis from a kind of ontogenetic point of view that he tried. He didn't publish it. It was published after he died. But you find something like this. He argues, and we don't need to read the whole thing, but he argues something amazing. I find it so genius. His point is that he says, you know, memories are formed by this sort of cataxis of external stimuli, and they get associated with your neurons. They get formed in certain ways, and these external perceptual processes, they leave a mark, and we call this kind of mark you can build upon a memory. And he says, well, but thought processes are not like that. He says, it may be possible to recognize and reproduce perceptual processes through their being associated with discharges of perception. But facilitations, that's kind of like pathways for him, produced by thought leave only their result behind them, not a memory. So you can't build on your thoughts. You can't look at your own thoughts because they don't leave a trace. And then he says that's what speech kind of does. You speak your mind, then you hear your own mind, and this forms something like a thought memory, right? So the indications of discharge by the way of speech help to make good of this lack of marks of thought. They put thought processes on a level with perceptual processes. They lend thought reality and makes it possible to remember them. So you can see that speech doesn't come at the end of the mental process. Speech is in the middle of it, because you wouldn't be able to relate the memory of a thought for Freud if in a certain way it didn't go through speech. So you wouldn't say that this is the end product. You would say it's in the loop, exactly in the sense that these guys are trying to say, which I find amazing. This is Freud's theory in 1890. And then he doesn't go into it anymore. He never touches this again, like in the systematic attempt, but I find it quite incredible. But just to say that there is actually a long, very weird and heterogeneous, I think, road of people who you could argue have a similar position. I didn't add Hegel here, even though I added a text in that package I uploaded for this meeting that discusses the connection to the extended mind hypothesis and objective spirit as well. So you can also look into that if you want. So in another text, Andy Clark, who is one of the main presenters of this project, he argues that surrogate reasoning or extended mind and these ideas, they imply a different theory of rationality and a different theory of our cognitive abilities, which they call bounded rationalities, amply explored today. Many different research programs are based on this. And they criticize, like they pit it against substantive rationality, right? So they say against the image of substantive rationality as a central capacity we have to maximize reward relative to a complete and consistent ordering of preferences, which people who know a bit of, neoclassical economics know that this is pretty much the rational theory subject, right? So they are already kind of arguing for something which is confronting the subject of rational choice theory. And they say, well, bounded rationality departs from different premises. First is that human brains often deploy cost-cutting problem-solving strategies that were more or less reliable in the original ecological setting. So you develop a solution to a problem in a setting, then rather than go through thinking about the whole process again in a new situation, you just it kind of saves time, save energy, and just repeat that strategy in a situation that is not so well adapted to that problem necessarily or to that strategy, but it has a good off chance of working as well there. So you don't really think through that situation on its own new terms. You just kind of cut costs, cut corners by reapplying these strategies on the go, right? All their premises are in this direction. So again, problems that are situated, they call it ecologically, but you could just call it situated problems of cognition. You need to answer in real time. You can't like take the time to reason as long as you need, right? Which means that the idea that you can gather all information needed, integrate it, and deduce a good solution, when you add time into the mix, you can see that this is probably not a good premise for how people reason, right? And the third thing they say that probably if you go with this, then adaptive behavior that is cutting corners with problem-solving strategies and that is answering real time without full information, it's best served by having multiple partial models of your environment rather than one big consistent model of everything everything is integrated. So it's kind of a multiple modeling thing that's partially integrating information, but not necessarily fully consistent. That sometimes is just overextending its reach to solve a situation where it wasn't meant to. So it's bounded, it's much weaker, right? And this helps to explain why the extended thesis is not just something external, added, auxiliary. If you stick with the bounded rationality thesis, if you want to answer questions such as, okay, but how such a weak cognitive creature gets to do some crazy things, that's when this prosthetic, extended, surrogate processes of reasoning are necessary. So it goes together. Again, mirrors very nicely the Freudian idea that, you're born partially complete. You're born like an incomplete being. You don't even have the means to integrate yourself with your body. And it takes like symbolic structure, speech, and other things to kind of knit together a sort of ipseity, right? So there's a similar feel that on the one hand, you're less than, And on the other, this leads you to be more entangled with the others and with language and social practices and so on. Please, guys, interrupt me if something is weird, doesn't make sense, or if I'm saying something wrong, because I'm sure there are people who know this better than me. So, for example, this is one example that they give. And I think it's good to show not only what it is about, but also how they work, which I think is this thing called the Parity Principle, or the limitation via substitution, which I think is even better. For example, they say, imagine you have a computer program that shows you a shape and tells you to fit it in the right socket. So you have like this upside down triangle and the square, right? And it should go in one of the two. So they say, imagine these three cases. The first case, you're seeing the triangle, you rotate it in your mind abstractly, just in your mental space. Well, there is a rotation that fits the socket, so you know now the answer. I added a little wavy line to say, well, you abstracted, you're in a mental space, right? Beyond the certain boundary we recognize as mental. The second is that, well, imagine that the computer program has a virtual spinning tool where I can actually do an action in the computer software that actually spins the circle until rotates it to the other position, and then I see that it fits. So whatever we call the mental actually is behind the choices to do the actions in the computer, but it's not doing the rotating, right? And then the third, which I mean, in a very nerdy way, they say, imagine a future, a cyber future where you have an implant. It's always like they always have an example which is totally bonkers. Like, imagine you have now an implant in your mind, which is with that computer program put in your mind, and you can access that virtual space only with your thought. And you can now use the virtual space to rotate and see the rotation in your mind rather than just do the mental operation. And then sorry, there's a question here. Yeah, then the argument is, let's see if I added the argument. Yeah, they say, if as we confront some task, a part of the world functions as a process which, if it were to happen in our heads, we would have no hesitation in recognizing it as part of the cognitive process, then that part of the world is, so we claim, part of the cognitive process. So if the only thing keeping me from calling this a cognitive action, when I shifted the triangle, I rotated it in the program, is where I put this boundary, because this rotation happened, this visualization happened in my mind, and this visualization happened in the computer screen. The only thing keeping those two things apart, even though they have the exact same function, is this line, then they say you should consider it by this parity principle. There is the same functionality happen. You can substitute one thing for the other and get the same result. Then you should just consider that substituted thing as part of the cognitive process.
Gabriel, okay. Just to see if I understood, because I think for a long time I didn't understand extended mind, because I thought that mind, and like when they talk about mind, they're not talking about consciousness. I think that's, for me, the way I started to understand that these two are different problems. So in the difference between, like, what's changing between these three examples is you have one case, for example, perception versus imagination, and in another one, private versus public stuff, right? So from 1 to 3, you have, the way I see it is like imagination, and 2 and 3, 1, you have imagination, 2, you have perception, you're externally perceiving, right? And 3, it's always a bit ambiguous in this kind of implants, if you're like perceiving this sort of like virtual screen in your head, or if you're imagining. So it's all, yeah. And then the first and third are private, and the second is external, right?
Sorry, say again. The first
and third are private, sort of like objects, and the second one is sort of like public.
Yeah. Yeah, I
And
think you could say
cognition,
that, but then again, like let's say if this is a software, it's
right?
determined by something which is external, right?
But in first order, it's at face value, it's appearing for you. Like you could.
Yeah, you could say this. It's private in the sense that it's only for your consciousness, right? So I think between this one and this one, what they get to do is just split interiority and determination, where this seems to be fully in the determination of your imagination, where this seems to be constrained by a software, even though it appears in the same private theater of consciousness, right?
But you could have also like a fourth case in which you have your own private thoughts, and there's some sort of like sensor, which is sort of like decoding your thoughts and projecting in a screen to a stadium, right? So it would be like indistinguishable, but
it would be embarrassing. That's the
yeah, it would be beyond embarrassing.
In the stadium.
Yeah. So
is the last one, Renzo, is one where you're not even aware of the experience that's going on?
In the last one, you're
The fourth one.
In the fourth one, it's a bit indistinguishable for the third, depending on how you construct. Like, it's just the sort of like the first one you still would have. It's like more organically part of you, like it's just your own organic perceptual system, but you have some sort of like EG which decodes and sort of like can replay it in a screen for like the way that people can actually like decode dreams and sort of like show what you're dreaming. So, but in the third case, it's built in a sense that it's artificially built and then implanted. So it's the origin is a bit different. So it sounds more cyber, but
yeah. I think that I have the impression that it's kind of naive when you read the text, like the way they introduce it. No wonder that a lot of people found problems with a bunch of stuff. Like it seems like it's not, the examples are not so tightly made to cover all possibilities. So they don't really show, like they don't really state so clearly. They give you an intuition, but they don't really state what it seems like they wanted to state.
Yeah, actually, I was going to ask what argumentative work is 3 doing? Like,
I have no idea. I wrote exactly that next to the example.
I see. I think the point is made with 2. Done. You don't need 3. I don't see what 3 is doing.
Yeah, I mean,
I think. Yeah, I have the impression because for me they are very different, the 3. But I think it's just because I'm caring about like more about like consciousness. And I think the point is to say that there's something about cognition that's indifferent to what is changing in these 3 cases. So from the point of view of public, private, the mode of like presentation, whether it's imagination or perception, for cognition, for what they're talking about, like it mattering for a cognitive process is a bit indifferent. So I think they.
Yeah. This is I stand corrected. Like I'm understanding them on their own terms. Like if they want to think of cognition and the use of tools that aid in cognition, then I think the point is made in 2. I don't really see the point of the third example. But I agree with you, Renzo. I agree with you. Regarding consciousness, like, of course, it's different.
Like, for example, there is a interlocutor who says, after looking at these 2, no, but what is determining for me of cognition is that this understanding takes place in the private theater of the mind. And then they say, okay, but imagine you're in that private theater and the logic that is doing the same function is not of your mind. So they had to come up with that example. Like it's external because it's an implant, but it's projecting internally. So if you're hereditary, right?
Then I have like, I think my puzzlement with this has a kind of symmetry with Renzo's, because Renzo has his own preoccupation with consciousness. I have my own preoccupation with language. So for me, 3 is already there. It's like language. So in a certain sense, you see. Yeah. So yeah, of course. Yeah.
No, they end the text exactly with that point. They, if I'm not mistaken, they recuperate the 3rd example to talk about, well, then shouldn't we say, considering the role of language as, you know, part of the cognitive process, that the self is actually there. So they go there in a kind of very vague way. But I think that what I really wanted to get from this part is just this idea of a functional, it functions the same in the understanding of a task, then you should be allowed to substitute these things. That's, I think, the crucial part for now. Like a lot of things.
So this is the parity. The parity is the fact that you can substitute one for the other.
Yeah, but you guys will see that it's weird that this is what they're claiming, because as we'll see in a moment, everyone who is interested in extended cognition is interested in what you can only do with the extension, not the things you can do without them as well. Like if I can do it by myself and then I can do with an extension, you're not going to convince me that, you know, I'm not just metaphorizing my mind in that, like it might just be modeling my own features. So it's only when you do something with this extension you couldn't do otherwise that it starts to look like a big problem, because then it's an irreducible part of some cognitive process. That becomes interesting. So I highlighted the substitution because it's challenged by some other theses in a bit.
Just a last small comment, just because this kind of substitution argument it plays a completely like different role in consciousness. There's like this sort of like debate going on. It's called the unfolding argument, and it's sort of like being used to like confront functionalist theories of consciousness and causal theory of consciousness. So IIT is a causal theory, and say more traditional ones are functionalists, and they argue a lot based using substitution. So if you and the argument goes a bit like you can keep appearance, like subjective appearance, the same while changing the sort of like composition. So you can like always change the sort of like thing that's being relevant for consciousness for a different like thing that's weirdly connected, like made of artificial stuff that has like different causal structure, and still keep the same appearance. So for causal theories, it matters a lot, the sort of like causal structure, whereas for functionalists, because it's doing the same function always, it shouldn't change consciousness. So this relation between between like composition, function, and consciousness, based on this like these smart substitutions you can use to sort of like falsify.
Yeah, I think you will see. Actually, I think we were going to go closer to that, because almost nothing from their original paper we keep as we go. I think only the idea that shouldn't we think about this thesis? I think that's pretty much what's left. I mean, anyway, you guys can assess it better than me probably as we go. So once they do this, they introduce another example, which I think has a nice idea into it, which we can use, which is they say, well, think about rotating, because, you know, like if they're talking about substitution, what do they have to say that somebody would prefer, or that it would be somehow essential to extend something rather than just do it mentally in the more classical sense? And they make this comparison in terms of velocity or effort, right? So playing Tetris, these two guys, Kirsch and Maglio, show that physical rotation of a shape in the Tetris button you place, right? So that the shape of the piece changes, it rotates before it fits or doesn't, right, in the game. And they show that, well, to achieve that rotation mentally takes 1,000 milliseconds. To achieve that rotation, pressing the button takes less time. So because of that, you would prefer to use the extended space of the computer system rather than your own mind. But you see why they need to argue it in that way, because they needed to do the same thing, because that's what justifies that the extension is cognitive. But they needed to do it, they need to find another property of the extended thing that makes it part of the process, right? And not just a relay or a repetition or something like that. And then they add this concept of epistemic actions. They go on to show that the physical rotation is used not just to position a shape ready to fit a slot, but often to help determine whether the shape and the slot are compatible. So when you're turning there, you're doing something at the level of understanding, not at the level of just completing an action, right? So they distinguish between epistemic actions, which alter the world so as to aid and augment cognitive processes such as recognition and search, and pragmatic actions, which alter the world because some physical change is desirable for its own sake, putting cement into a hole in a dam. So then things start getting interesting, because now they're taking a function of a mental process, which is to rotate things in your mind to better understand them. And they're now claiming that the extended system has an epistemic function, which is you're rotating things for the sake of understanding, not for the sake of producing a desirable change. So that idea of epistemic action seems relevant. Then they introduce the big example, which is the one that the paper is famous for, which is Inga and Otto. Inga wants to go to the theater. Where is the theater? She accesses her own memory, and she recalls that the modern art actually is not the theater, I got it wrong. It's the Museum of Modern Art. It's on the 53rd Street. And then that's where she goes. And Otto has Alzheimer, and he writes everything down in a notebook. In his notebook, it is written that the museum is on the 53rd Street. So when he wants to go there, he looks in the notebook, it's written there, and that's where he gets his clue for a solution, right? And then they add this claim that, okay, of course, in a certain sense, your memory and the notebook are distinct, but perhaps we should first look at what they have in common. And they say, well, from that functionalist point of view, the notebook is like a memory in the sense that it keeps these properties, that it is a constant in Otto's life, that is directly available without difficulty, that once you retrieve the information, he automatically endorses the information there. It's not up to discussion if what's written is true or not. And then they say this thing, but they're not sure if it's necessary, that the information was used in the past. It was already endorsed in some points of the past, and indeed is there as a consequence of this endorsement. So, but they say the status of the fourth feature for a criterion of belief is arguable, because what they want to show is that we're not just talking about memory devices or some aids that is kind of external, because they say, well, if most people accept that beliefs are part of your cognitive kind of structure, the structure of your beliefs, and they say, well, the belief that Otto has is not that the museum is the 53rd Street. He doesn't know that. What he knows is that he can trust the notebook, and the notebook says this. So the belief in the notebook, and therefore the belief that the museum is on this street, they actually get entangled in his understanding of the world and his cognition, in the same way that her belief, Inga's belief that the museum is on the 53rd Street because she remembered it, which is a constant thing that is directly available to her, that she endorses automatically as it comes up, and that she used it before. That's why she did it. That's why she trusted. So it's a similar argument to the shapes and right of a problem, and you access something and then you have a solution, and you try to displace, substitute a mental process for an external one, and try to argue that somehow the function is that external thing is playing is the same. But in this case, they go one step further and they say this involves a certain level of belief that is objectified in that notebook. And the belief in the notebook is playing a role that the belief in the statement plays directly for Inga. She doesn't have to, and they even say, imagine that she drank a lot, or she ate a lot of sleeping pills or whatever. Perhaps she doesn't trust her memory. So it is possible that she also has a bit of a external relation to it. And then they say from that perspective, it's interesting to think that, so the mere fact that the external processes are external, where consciousness is internal, is no reason to deny that those processes are cognitive. Or interestingly, one might argue that what keeps real cognition processes in the head is the requirement that cognitive processes be portable. I really like this argument. Like, the argument is the inverse, right? From this point of view, is the brain is really good because in the realm of extended cognitions, it is a portable kit you can take, and not, so it is, let's say, a special case of instantiated kind of external systems and not the origin, and then you have the external ones. You can kind of come up with a weird theory backwards from that perspective in a way, right? So why keep all the cognitive processes in your head when you can actually have them in the world? Well, because then they are portable. You don't need to carry all these things that you rely on for memory and for everything with you. It's very similar to Hegel's argument about the difference between plants and animals, where Hegel said that plants have intestines outward and animals have portable intestines. And you could say, but they still have brains outward in the environment, which is Hegel's arguments concerning the spirit of a species, right? And then humans have that portable, just like animals have their intestines inwards, you know? So you could make an argument in that weird direction. And they say, well, and clearly one of the big problems is that, so we have moved by a vision of what we call the naked mind, a package of resources and operations we can always bring to bear in a cognitive task, regardless of the local environment. The trouble with coupled systems like this, where some stuff is with us, some stuff is in the world, is that they can be decoupled easily. And that's not really interesting, like in perhaps an evolutionist point of view, right? And then they end the text with this: what about socially extended cognition? Pretty much they ask all the questions, like, what about socially extended cognition? What about the self? What about language? And they have one paragraph, but they say, could my mental state be partially constituted by the states of other thinkers? And they say, we don't see a reason why not. They have this really good example of unusually interdependent couples. It's possible that one partner's beliefs will play the same role for the other as the notebook does for Otto. What is central is the high degree of trust, reliance, and accessibility, as they said. So they accept in some sense that you could move from this sort of material, more static, handable, passive in a certain sense, structures for these extended cognitive apparatuses, and have actually social interactions or social relations to play that role, but they don't really take that very far. But that insight is taken further by this other guy called Sean Gallagher. He wrote this text called The Socially Extended Mind. And he says, well, the idea of socially extended mind builds on the inactive idea of social affordances. Just as a notebook or a handheld piece of technology may be viewed as affording a way to enhance or extend our mental possibilities, so our encounters with others, especially in the context of various institutional processes and social practices, may offer structures that support and extend our cognitive ability. So for him, let's say, if Otto wrote in a notebook that 53rd Street is where the museum is, and if you don't need to remember where the museum is because there is one of those tourist guide things that tells you this, and you can ask and they will tell you 53rd Street, and it's easily accessible, you trust it, the belief in that thing is part of your own system of beliefs, just as the belief and trust in your own memory is, then you could say that this is part of your cognitive ecology or cognitive space, right? But he doesn't like the way that they frame the discussion. They say that the problem with the example of Otto and Inga and those things, that it frames the discussion with a concept of the mind that the extended mind hypothesis is trying to challenge. So it focuses on kinds of mental states, so belief embedded in memory, desire to find a museum, things like that, as a kind of strong point of the starting point. So they want to get to the museum, and then what tools do they have, like their memory, the notebook, right? And Gallagher wants to say, look, if you want to understand social cognition, you should be able to have other criteria for what is understanding or what is cognition here, because these three criteria that seem to apply to such mental states and are generalized to all cognitive processes by Chalmers and Clark, that neither the standard belief desire psychology nor these criteria necessarily apply to all cognition, especially if one thinks of cognition in dynamic terms of inactive cognitive processes and activities such as problem solving, interpreting, judging, rather than in terms of mental states or static contents. Neither a violation of this criteria nor any lack of parity with internal mental states should disqualify such processes from being considered cognitive if they are processes to which the human organism is linked in the right way. That is, in a two-way interaction, creating a couple system that can be seen as a cognitive system in its own right. So you see, like, they're already not going to require that, you extend your belief in the notebook, but it ultimately plays the same role as the mental process of believing your memories or something like that. They want to say, Gallagher wants to say, okay, we want to talk about the expansion of cognition to social practices, but we need the result to work as a cognitive system, but it doesn't mean that we need to functionally recognize parts doing what other parts do. Right? So the criteria for trusting this sort of extended element, or the principle for recognizing what is part of it or not, which is this parity principle. Both things he wants to put aside, right? And I think that this is already where we leave the substitutive idea behind, because he says, in contrast to the constrictive effect of this criteria, he proposes that I appeal to certain social practice institutions that are what we might call mental institutions, in the sense that they're not only institutions with which we accomplish certain cognitive process, but also are such that without them, such cognitive process would no longer exist. So they're not just substituting internal processes for faster ones. Like, I can recall where the theater is, but I'm going to ask somebody because it's faster, or I'm going to look in the notebook. They're constituting processes that would not exist without the social practice that we're kind of relying on. So this is just a stupid idea for, you have a problem, you have kind of a mental space where you can extract some information that's part of that space, you can access it, and it's relevant. The substitution thesis says that, well, if from the problem I can access an external space, an extended space, retrieve the same information that takes me to the same answer, so if I can substitute the two, then this is part of cognition. Whereas what Gallagher is trying to point to is something else, which is, if I only use my mental space, the sort of information I can retrieve takes me to one solution. Whereas if I take the extended space that includes these other things, I can get to new information, which takes me somewhere new, that is constituting a new thing, which I couldn't get without that extension. Examples are things like legal systems, research practices, cultural institutions. So for him, a mental institution includes cognitive practices that are produced in specific times and places, and two, is activated in ways that extend our cognitive processes when we engage with them. There's a lot of critique that he also receives because of these, when we engage with them. These guys are so, like, I don't know how they're so stupid to talk about social stuff. Like, imagine thinking that you're not part of the legal system when you're not engaging with it. Like, I don't know, like, it sounds naive a bit. Like, when I went to the clerk and asked for information about where to find some document, I'm engaging with the legal system. But when I don't see any police or no judge in front of me, the legal system doesn't exist. Like, it was rightfully kind of mocked a bit, how kind of easily uncoupled it is, and slightly naive from certain perspectives, perhaps. So he continues and he says, I think this is the example that he gives, just to give you an example of how he thinks these things. So he says, consider, for example, a contract or legal agreement, which in some real sense, which is an expression of several minds externalized and extended into the world, instantiating in external memory an agreed upon decision, adding to a system of rights and laws that transcend the particularities of any individual's mind. contracts are institutions that embody conceptual schemas that in turn contribute to and shape our cognitive processes. They're not just only a product of certain cognitive exercises, but are also used as tools to accomplish certain aims, to enforce certain behaviors, solve certain problems. Institutions of property, contract, right, law, not only guide our thinking about social arrangements or about what we can and cannot do, but allow us to think in ways that were not possible without such institutions. So for example, you wouldn't have questions such as, you know, can I fuck my landlord over since he's kicking me out of my home? That is not even, that question doesn't even have a reference without the institution. So in some way, the institution, I need to address the set of laws to answer my query, but I wouldn't even have a referent to that problem if it weren't for that system itself. Yeah?
When he's talking about cognitive processes, is it like, just for a lack of better word, is like a type of process where he's like explicitly thinking something? Is that the limit of what he's thinking about cognitive processes, or like the act of doing of engaging with the legal system will contribute to cognitive processes even if you don't explicitly elaborate them? Or is it just
I think in that sense, cognition versus consciousness is good, right? Like your dealings with the legal system is helping you understand something. You might not be fully conscious of every step, perhaps you don't need to, but I would put in the actual practice of it, right? Not just the contemplating of the contract as a concept.
Yeah. I think that's that's my question. Okay, thanks.
But I agree. I mean, their theory of social practices, I mean, it's not their topic, right? So it's a bit, they play fast and loose with it.
Yeah, because I'm not to be the one to bring the Nazi into the room, but it reminds me a lot of the different, what Heidegger is talking about when he's talking about the manual mode of being. There is, in a sense, also an extended mind. He talks about the wind, or I think he even mentions in some cases, I can't recall correctly if he talks about social practices, but he maintains a distinction of the ready at hand and what is the other, it's the one where you're manually invested in something, and the other one where you're just contemplating.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't know. Like, perhaps somebody can compare that better. Let me explain what he means so you can see if it makes sense, because I think
sure.
Yeah, I think it's saying something slightly different. Like, for example, he makes, again, you can see it's the same type of thing. He makes this other example. He says, now think of these three situations. You have Alexis, she's a judge. She's presented with a collection of evidence and is asked to judge the legitimacy of a claim. The first case, she has the facts and she's asked to decide make her judgment on the basis of her own subjective sense of fairness, weighing the evidence entirely on her head. So she needs to decide what is relevant, think about what's, crucial, the preferences in a certain sense, and make a judgment, which then enforces the decision. All of this is happening subjectively. Then in the second scenario, experts specify the kind of questions that she can address. So what is relevant is now abstracted outside of her. So it's not really, I'm not sure if it's the kind of manual or kind of user point of view of like, I'm just using this and not reflecting over it. Perhaps that's an indifferent question to some point. The point is that there is part of the abstraction that would be a mental abstraction that is now happening at the social level. There's a social process of abstraction in the sense of filtering out the facts to relevant things, which will probably appear as documents or statements by experts, right? Then she uses her principles, which now are probably different from the principles when she was just thinking of it without the relevant aspects being decided outside and the considerations she can address being said outside, and then she makes her judgment. And then the third scenario is where experts further provide possible answers and a set of rules to follow in making her decision. So not only do they filter out what is relevant, they also filter out the rules through which she can answer to the relevant things. And then she just makes the judgment, and that's the decision. So you see, it's again, the kind of substitutive thing, but in a certain sense, he's also trying to suggest to you that these externalizations of the relevant parts and of the principles is actually expanding some sense what sort of decisions she can make. She can take more things into consideration that she wouldn't be able if she's just filtering through what's relevant. And she can be more coherent with the social legal system if she's told about rules that guarantee that her ruling is in accordance with other rulings, for example. So it's not simply substitution, but proper expansion, right? There is some sense of functional similarity, some isomorphism going on. In some sense, things are the same, but the more it goes outside, the better it becomes in terms of, capacity to do something. So we're already outside of the Chalmers initial position, right? It's something more active in the sense that it does something better than you would doing your own, right? And we're actually closer to Hegel as well. For him, this is how objective spirit works, pretty much. So he continues and he says, judgment made in such contexts and specific kind of judgments that are made are forms of cognition that depend on the large and complex system without which they could not happen. So these judgments, that's why they are numbered differently, right? This judgment here, the form that it takes, it's overdetermined by this whole external thing here. And it takes a shape that it would never appear were it not for that externalization, right? Indeed, these cognitive practices are such that in principle, they could not happen just in the head. Even in the case of highly trained attorney who seemingly does her legal reasoning in her head, what she does, what makes it the kind of cognition that it is, depends not only on the fact that she has previously engaged in the workings of the legal system, but on the ongoing workings of the legal system since what she engages in, that is the particular cognitive process of forming a legal judgment, is what it is only in that system. So even in the case you want to say, well, but I'm just doing it mentally, in a certain sense, you can now invert the order and say, yeah, that's you extending it outside of the legal system to a place that's portable, so you can continue thinking about it at home. But ultimately, the referent of those abstractions remains this extended system. Then Gallagher kind of does a reconstruction of the genesis of this debate. And he says, look, this whole discussion of socially mind institutions or socially extended cognition through institutions, the guys who kind of start this in behavioral economics and so on are this Denzau and North. And they have a text called Ideologies and Institutions, which is quite interesting, where they argue that, well, there's a problem in neoclassical economics. We don't take in consideration the collective models that people have about their environments, which can differ. They're not like universal, based on substantive rationality. And they propose two types of models. There are ideologies, which are collective mental models. So people talk, and they start kind of resonating into a certain kind of way of seeing things that they share. But it's now just shared as mental models, right? It's not instantiated anywhere. But there is the opposite, which then people interact, and what coalesces, what sediments is actually the social practice itself, not the sort of mental model of conceptual dealings with the world. And those are institutions. And those two things are two ways of mediating between individuals and their environment, right? So it says, under conditions of uncertainty, individuals' interpretations of their environment reflect their learning. Individuals with common cultural backgrounds and experience will share reasonably convergent mental models, ideologies, and institutions. And individuals with different learning experiences will have different theories to interpret their environment. So they're kind of trying to make it a bit more complex where economists are coming from when they think they need to model human psychology. but do it in this kind of institutional analysis kind of way. So Gallagher says, look, these are the guys that kind of start thinking about this. And he says, well, if you take this kind of theory, markets are socially extended cognitive institutions. That means that market forces, rather than external constraints or inert substructures, constitute an economic order enacted in the dynamical interplay of embodied, situated, and materially engaged agents who maintain relational autonomy in a world that's both physical and social. Yeah, this sounds like a totally random sentence now that I read it out loud. Like, just has all the nice words, but I'm not sure what they mean. So much as that he's saying that, you know, the marketplace, the actual market made of interactions that constrain you in some ways, it's like the legal system in his previous example, in the sense that it's both extending what you get to know about your environment and also creating processes that would never exist without the market. So you wouldn't be thinking about the way I buy the rice for $3.50 or the other rice for $4.25, and then I don't get the dessert that I wanted. There's a whole bunch of statements and judgments you're making that only exist because of the market. They go through the market. They're not just thoughts. They actually go through what actions you can take and actions you can't, right? Just a second. I lost it. The power went off. So he's arguing that in the direction of both Hayek and this North guy, we should see this idea of socially extended cognition in this direction, right? And they say, and then they mention a text by Clark, another text by Andy Clark called Economic Reasoning, Gallagher, but now he's writing with this other guy, which is really cool because he shows that just read a part of their quote. They say, social and economic environments are more than passive products of human agency. They actively contribute to the reproduction of the stable organizations and practices that enable and constrain human behaviors. They're more than inert structures of information. And then they say, the idea that economic decision-making takes place in such highly scaffolded environments, right? So I'm not deciding with regards to my environment. I'm deciding and acting with regards to a market that also constrains my do's and don'ts. So economic decision-making is not happening in this arrow here. It's happening in this triangle here. And this helps to explain why neoclassical economic works. And insofar as it works at all, between quotes, because this is a quote from Clark's text. And Clark shows something amazing. He brings back some studies. I forgot the names of the authors, but they do these sort of experiments called zero intelligence trader models. And zero intelligence trader is like they create a model of an auction. So you need to decide if you bid or don't bid on something, the price is this or too high, too low. And usually you would think that you should model this, like you have to have some idea about the weights that the actor has. Like, how do you maximize your gain, minimize your losses, for example? And they try to show that the external ecological constraints of the markets for competition, for things like that, they're more than enough to account in these models for the success rates of the traders. If you substitute these agents who trade based on weights of maximizing gains and minimizing losses for a random trader who has no intelligence, no weights, you only lose 1% of accuracy in the way that the model works. So it's pretty much indistinguishable if you worked with an agent that has preferences or if you work with a random agent, right? So Clark says that it's interesting that the neoclassical market theory, it only functions in large scale analysis where competition and other environment constraints of economic life highly reduce the space of what companies can do. And it doesn't work at all in consumer theory, where individuals are very little constrained and therefore could choose between many, many, many things. Then this whole idea that you're trying to maximize your gains, minimize your losses, it takes you the same place than if you assumed random choices. So once you add the scaffolding, as they call this external world, which already embeds parts of your cognitive processes that you're not doing, once you add that part into the equation, you can explain why rational theory works without endorsing it, because it only works when the rational actor is the market itself. When it's meant to be the individual, it doesn't work. But that's not how reality works as well for them. I think, Rafa, you want to say something?
Yeah, no, I'm gonna pass on that because like I think I think you made the point clear. I was just remembering about because in some sense like on can you go back to the previous slide please, just so to see if I'm getting this right, because I'm trying to fit something like a concrete case into this sort of like a diagram, because for instance like what would be something like the Black-Scholes-Merton model of pricing options, for example, like because it's like a model, it's embedded in a certain market ideology in a way, but it's also like a very concrete model in which like people literally start running the softwares in which like options are priced and evaluated by like rating agencies and so on. So like it's a very concrete thing also. So like how do we take like a construct like that, for example, and we look, because it in a way like sort of crosses the boundaries, because it becomes like it says something cultural even about investment after the 70s and 80s, and like it gives them a Nobel Prize of Economics at the time. But it also says something about the environment as such, because it starts being widely implemented and it starts working only because of like, not because it reveals some truth about prices as such,
it's shaping the prices.
Yeah, it imposes a regularity to something that is like more regularity into something that is not that regular before.
Exactly. So for example, to take something simpler, right? But it could be exactly what you're saying. For example, the existence of markets are changing the environment, and also markets are shaped by the environment. So a lot of the shaping and abstracting is actually happening here. What is left to the individual. So for example, you would say something like, yeah, I went to the market and I bought the cheaper rice. And then from the standpoint of the market, where you have labor power, which needs means of subsistence the cheaper as possible, and you have the price of rice, so the decision to buy the cheapest rice, you're imposed on you. You need to buy it. From the standpoint of market ideology, you bought it because you're trying to maximize your gains. You're going to buy the cheapest one because you want to lose the least. So it doesn't match actual, like that whole reasoning doesn't happen in your head. That reasoning happens when the marketplace prepared that choice. You either survive by buying the cheap rice or you die, right?
Yeah.
So that abstraction happened at this level here of the market being constrained in this way and also constraining the environment in this way. Sorry, what's in here? The dialogical move is projecting the model of neoclassical economics from real economic to natural.
Yeah,
I think it's both. I mean, I think that the simple way I can think about it is just saying, perhaps, the rational choice actor model, it's more part of modeling this, how people end up thinking about themselves to locate themselves in this world, where in practice they are just responding to this, which is something else, right? So it fits Althusser's idea of, imaginary relations to your real conditions of existence, right? So the real social practice is this one, but you localize yourself in this way, right?
and it's interesting that it becomes like tenable with like an old, like it sort of, like it doesn't really solve, but it like delays the problem of classical political economy in a way, because the problem of classical political economy is like, if you look at Smith, for example, there is an equivalency between the quality of language in humans and the quality of trade. Like you put both of these things as two like natural endowments of humans that give humans both a little bit more trouble in terms of distribution, but also a little bit like more pleasure in terms of like being able to form a civilization or something, and to act in a properly social world in a way. And I think it sort of rebrands both of these things by like through the concept of information in a very weird manner. Like it doesn't solve the problem at all, but it like makes the distinction that Gabriel was talking about, which like it doesn't work at all in the micro level, but it works very well in the micro level, but it works very well on the macro. And then it sort of makes this like distinction acceptable and like pretends it's not a contradiction at all. Like
yeah, and I think that, I mean, what we don't have we'll be able to say in a bit, with a couple of other slides, but what we can say is that once we leave the extended cognition field to the distributed cognition, where we're allowed to say that firms are the actors, not people, then the rational theory applies, because firms are the things that are actually constrained by the theory. And when you go you go beyond the right resolution to the level of the individual, then it becomes just an ideology, because at that level, people are not competing in that clear-cut sense of few choices and you know your preferences, you order them, you choose, right? So, but it takes one extra step, I think, to be able to get there. So once this guy presents this and he says this thing about, yeah, so, you know, look, what confirms this idea that markets are mental institutions is that you can remove the individual. You can have a model where the individual is just a random behavior, and still the model works if you assume that the mental processing, the cognitive processing is happening at the institutional level, right? I found a couple of good papers on this. One that is criticizing rational theory from that standpoint, but very politely. So it's almost like, oopsie, I found a bit of a problem. And there are these tests done by this Farajun guy and this other guy are this modeling of these auctions, which seems to be like the big kind of argument. But then there is this other guy who wrote a text called Symbiotic Cognition as an Alternative for Socially Extended Cognition. So you see, we're slowly going down this very weird rabbit hole. And he criticizes Gallagher for being a bit too quick. And he says, although I'm very sympathetic to the idea of extended cognition, I will argue that the extended cognition framework is not appropriate to characterize the way in which social institutions enable, enhance, and co-constitute cognitive processes. And he says that I will argue that the idea that social institutions extend our cognition mistakenly conflates functional integration and task dependencies. He tries to get these two concepts kind of to base. No, not Farjun and Machover. No.
Yeah, I was thinking like, yeah, how did you get there?
No, it's Gode and Sander. They are the guys who do the first studies. And then there is Ferrejon, Zatz and Ferrejon. Right? I can post the names afterwards. It's in the Andy Clark paper in the little package I sent you. So he says that we need to start with these two ideas. Functional integration is this extended thing, functionally integrated, and then do the tasks of that extension, are they does the cognitive process depend on them highly or not? And they will say, look, Slor says, look, if you look from this perspective, you see we need a larger system of distinctions. So he'll say that social institutions constitute cognitive capacities more principally through task dependency. And he says that extended processes which have strong task dependency but low functional integration, so you can uncouple things very easily and pretty much everything stays the same. They are different from things where you highly integrate with that thing to the point that you almost cannot do without it. And perhaps it's not even so task dependent on it even. So there are many different ways to do it. One of the crucial things he introduces is this whole project, which honestly is probably the coolest one of the people working on this. We could just do one discussion on him if you guys wanted, which is Edward Hutchings' project. He has this really cool book called Cognition in the Wild, where he does a sort of anthropology of how a maritime vessel from the Navy is steered in the ocean. He was a sailor himself, so he kind of tries to create these maps of actions of the sailors on the boat and show that nobody knows where the boat is going. Only if you take them all as a sort of one unit could you find a subject who kind of is steering the boat. But individually, they're too decomposed in their actions. One person is just marking a map. The other person is taking the mark of the map and putting in some equipment. Then the guy in the steering wheel is just looking at the equipment and steering it a bit, sends a signal to somebody else who is then doing something else to the rudder and so on. Nobody's actually turning it. And he uses this as the basis to the theory of distributed cognition. So Slors introduces one more term and says distributed cognition is usually kind of brought together with extended cognition, but there is an important difference. The central contrast in the debate is that of internalism versus active externalism. Should we or should we not view external items that our brains are coupled with as part of a cognitive processes? But in distributed cognition, that's not an issue. The central contrast in the distributed cognition literature is a centered perspective on cognition of individuals versus a distributed perspective on the interconnection of collaborating individuals. So it's not so much a matter of is it inside or outside, but more of is it individual or collective, the point of view of the synthetic point of view, right? So Hutchings says distributed cognition is not a kind of cognition, it's a perspective on all cognition. Cognition emerges from the interaction between distributed processes with no process or set of processes that is the center or the hub of the overall cognitive process. In principle, such a perspective can be adopted at all scales. So once he introduced this, he says that nothing in the idea that social institutions are distributed cognitive systems, which is something that Gallagher actually said, he mixes extended and distributed, suggests that social institutions are part of the individual's minds. So the idea is not that individual minds or brains are coupled with larger parts of institutions in exactly the same way that Otto is coupled with his notebook. So you cannot say the legal system is like the Otto's guy notebook, right? To play your part as a teacher in an educational system or as a judge in a legal system is much more complex and versatile, if only because a social institution is quite a different item than a notebook. It doesn't mean that a judge's cognition is less tightly connected with the legal system than Otto's is with this notebook. In fact, arguably, it's the other way around. The cognitive tasks of a judge are not just aided, enhanced, or made possible by a system she's part of, as Otto's memory is with his notebook. They are created by the system. The point, however, is that to claim this is not necessarily to claim that the system or a large part of it is part of a judge's mind. So Slors thinks it's more cohesive. He finds some problems that are usually problems raised against extended minds hypotheses. Exactly. You're slowly seeing them becoming Marxist. You know, like Slors is like 1 minute away from saying, perhaps there's something like an automatic subject that constrains. It's like this far away from it.
I'm honestly cheering that my field becomes like 10 years.
Cognitive Marxist, yeah. So you see, he's not claiming that, okay, just because it's weird to say social institutions are things you coupled into like a notebook, and that you're extending things into, like, he finds this a weird way of describing it. You're you're integrated into it in a different way, but this is not to say that the integration is weak. On the contrary, it's to say that perhaps it's stronger. Yeah, I don't think you need to claim Hayek is a Marxist if you're with these guys here. I mean, to be honest, I don't think you need to turn into a Marxist just because you're getting a better grip on cognition. You can still be an asshole. So I mean, you guys will see it never goes as far enough. It's very frustrating, and I do think that there is conceptual reasons for it. You will see there. I think I managed to identify a point that is interesting in this debate, but let's see. So Slors does this sort of thing. I think we can use to distinguish what he's trying to propose, right? So from the standpoint of distributed cognition, like I created a little idea, right? Where you have a problem and some mental model you have would allow you to extract information to arrive at some place, but with the extended, you can actually guess some information that takes you to a different place, right? And for the extended cognition, let's say the thing that is being confirmed by the isomorphism or some level of homogeneity between the mental and the extended is the individual's mind. So for example, Gallagher is arguing that because the judge can go beyond her own mental capacities through the legal system, that her mind was made bigger, right? So you identify some invariance, like what varies here in a similar way. And then you say, well, that's the name of that similarity is the judge's mind, right? It's her mind that is confirmed by the invariance. In distributed cognition, that's not the case. Guys, could you say things out loud rather than writing in the chat? Like, it's really hard to keep track of the questions.
It seems it seems like the mind, through task dependency or being integrated into a system, that it participates in another mind, whatever that mind might be, or even if it does not exist as a. Could you say something?
It's a good question. I'll present, let's just present one more slide, then I think we can perhaps answer that question better. Because what I wanted you guys to get just from this one is that, you see, this is the argument for the extended art proposal, right? My mind remains invariant for every mental state or mental model that I have. And well, I was able to extend it by going through this external thing, but it's still my mind ultimately. So it's still the individual's mind. So it's centered on the individual cognition. And this Hutchings project is to show that, yeah, these minds are bounded to partial perspectives. They're just integrating social external systems like the navigating of the big ship, right? And if you want to find the synthetic point of view, it's more like their collective mind is the mind for the body of the vessel. Another example that Hutchings uses in a really cool text is how pilots drive a plane. And he says, ultimately, it's more common sense, like it fits better to say that they are collectively the mind for the body of the plane than to say that the plane is an extension of their minds and of their individual bodies, because all the purposes, all the relevant information concerns the plane, not their bodies. So there is a shift between the distributed cognition and the extended cognition that concerns not so much this path, which might be the same, right? Concerns the nature of this arrow and the nature of this invariance. You can say, if these things are the same, then it's my mind. Or you can say, if these things are the same, it's because I'm part of something bigger. So I agree with your point. Like, this is kind of participatory. This is more kind of handling, right? I handle a tool. It's more like the model here, right? And like a prosthetics. And here is more like, I don't know what's the name for this. I mean, I would have to think. I've never seen the theory of this thing anywhere. So yeah, so it's more like participation or something like that, engagement or whatever you want to call it. So with this in mind, once he presented this, he defines what functional integration is and what task dependency is, so we can use them to construct different concepts, right? So it says, functional integration is the extent to which the execution of tasks involves coupling with items external to the brain and body. So high functional integration, so things are functionally integrated a lot, means that the items external to the brain and body are tightly and reliably coupled with you. To the point that you would say they're constitutive elements of cognitive processing. Low functional integration means that they're external to the brain and body, not tightly coupled. They can be seen as enabling or enhancing, but in some sense, the cognitive processes would exist without them anyway. Like calculators, you wouldn't be able to calculate high numbers on your head, but the cognitive processes that you do when you're coupled with the calculator, they are accessible without it. So there's low functional integration with a calculator. And task dependency is the extent to which the intelligibility of tasks depends on larger whole of coordinated tasks. It sounds, for people who remember the manufacturer in Marx, when he talks about the detail worker and the unit is only seen as the whole, that's task dependency, right? Task dependency is a notion that's connected with coordination and planning. It's a normative notion in the sense of high task dependency means that task plays specific roles in the overall organization of a cognitive system. So it's not like physical integration with some external thing. It's more like the very meaning of an action only makes sense if you shift perspective and look at the system of tasks to understand a single task, right? So with this, you can understand this quite easily. He makes so low and high task dependency, low and high functional integration. And you can get 4 types: embedded cognition, extended cognition, symbiotic, and distributed. That's kind of the topic. The role of his paper is to explain this 4, to correct Gallinger, right? So the first is embedded. It's like following signs at an airport. So it's not very integrated. You rely on something outside of you, which is the sign saying, move this way. You wouldn't know where to move without the sign, right? But at the same time, it's very low. There's no process that you can only achieve or even name because of the sign. And you can still think pretty much the same without the sign. It's just kind of adding an information, like a relay moment inside your cognitive process that is coming from the outside, that's inside the loop, right? But doesn't have a lot of integration. And the task dependency is also very low. Let's say the set of normative tasks you need to do to read the sign, know where to go. It's not like suddenly you have all these tasks that only make sense if you take the sign into consideration, right? So it's low task dependency, low functional integration. Then what he understands as Chalmers' idea, Clark's idea, which is extended cognition, he says it's highly functionally integrated, but has low task dependency. Remember, we realized that we could usually name the process only in a mental example without recourse to the external thing, like memory or finding directions or recalling a thing. Like those are all already kind of mental tasks. So we don't need the external thing to name the task. The task exists on its own as a mental task, but functionally, it can be highly integrated in the sense that you might be able to only access that task, for example, using pen and paper to do complex calculations. But there's nothing in the calculation itself, in the task of calculating, which exists only because you're using pen and paper. I mean, there is some things, definitely, like little tricks to how to sum and multiply and divide, but to sum, to divide, to multiply can be done without these things, right? Then he says, well, you have the 4th, which is distributed cognition, which is Hutchings' examples, like sailors using multiple signals and coordinating strategies to navigate this vessel in the ocean. So it's highly functionally integrated. It's impossible to do without the apparatuses, the maps, all the people interacting. Like it doesn't exist as something which you could do on your own. You're just extending it like using a calculator. And it's also highly task dependent because most of these tasks only have meanings in the larger normative structure of organization or organizing yourselves in that way. Are these differences making sense?
Could you redefine task dependency? I think
Yeah, I think the way I understand it is just that intelligibility of tasks depends on the extended system.
Oh yeah, I was going to say, isn't it like saying that there can be, you can think of like a synthesis of tasks. So a lot of micro tasks can be integrated together to be like a larger task.
Yeah, but I think the difference here is low task dependency is something like, to remember where I want to go, I need to recall the name of the place, recall where it is, then I can go there. So the tasks are recall the name, recall where it is, know where I am, then I'll know how to get there. So those tasks, I can name them and I can understand what they are without recourse to the external apparatus that might substitute my mental apparatus. So if I do the same with a notebook, it's almost isomorphic to doing them in my head. Like I will look to the map, I will localize myself in the map, I will see where the museum is in the map, and I will go there. So it's the same tasks, right? So the intelligibility of those tasks, the names of those tasks and the function of them are clear without the extension. Whereas in a sailboat, where you're coordinating with other people, like annotating a number and then giving that paper to some guy, that task in itself, it's not a navigating task in any sense outside of that boat. It only makes sense as a task in the context of all the other tasks that other people are doing and the equipments and the vessel and so on. So the synthetic point of view is no longer like you cannot start from your mental or individual cognition and then you're finding analogies with other external things. You're a part of a larger thing, right? And the larger thing gives the meaning.
It's like you have two maps, and one is your mental map and the other is this sort of like social map, and you compare like how good they do the job, right? So you might have one case in which your mental map can do the work and it can sort of like use as a tool or as a part to sort of like complete your own map, something external. And on the other hand, you can have like stuff in which the map is a social institution in which you might not even know like the full picture, and you more or less function as a sort of like, you can only function once you're participating in this bigger thing.
Yeah,
right?
for example, you might know how to do your part, but you don't know how to explain what the whole is doing, right? So you cannot account for the whole thing, you can only account for your part.
And like when you do like use a calculator or like the drawing in itself, it's sort of like also partial and incomplete. It only has a meaning once it's part of your mental like.
Yeah, I agree. I
operation.
think task dependency is almost like part and whole discussion. Is your cognition the whole in which the external A is the part, or is your cognition the part of which the external is the whole? Right? I think that's kind of what it is. And then the functional integration has more to do with if they can be decoupled and remain what they are or not.
Could you say that the difference between low task dependency and high task dependency could be thought of in a restricting of the tasks themselves, in the sense that I'm thinking about the legal system. I mean, to repeat the example that was used earlier, like if the legal system is to work, we have to have like a lawyer of the accuser who restricts himself to do one thing, and then the defendant's lawyer has to do another thing, the prosecutor does another thing, the jury does its own thing, and the judge does the other. So in that sense, it would be high task dependency, because each particular mind would restrict themselves to one certain task. But if you have, like, for example, I don't know, in corrupt legal systems, like you have a judge who does not follow the rules. So in that sense, there's a low task dependency in practice, because he can actually just
do what he pleases.
Yeah, he can name what justice is.
Yeah.
So in a sense, you could even measure the workings of different compositions by that. You don't have to choose. I think maybe that's what's interesting.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Like, for example, like classic movies about, attorneys and so on. You're just doing your small job, and people tell you, like, trust the system. They're saying, like, I know you have partial information, partial action, but you're part of something bigger in which you trust to give meaning to your partial action. Whereas the corrupt guy, the definition of corrupt is that, like, the whole model of his action is contained in his system of individual preferences. And everyone is kind of the extension of his preference.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So, yeah.
It's really useful, this idea.
But you didn't. I don't think you elaborated, or maybe you will, on what would be a symbiotic.
Yeah,
cognition.
exactly. That's the fourth one. So that's the one he wants to introduce, which is the idea that low functional integration, meaning things can be easily uncoupled, but still high task dependency.
I was going to give an example of that because of your discussion previous. Like I always think of the orchestra kind of like that.
Perfect.
Like everybody has his own sheet music in front. They have to reproduce that sheet music. Not shit music, sheet music.
Sometimes, yeah.
I just thought that was people may be understanding shit music, no sheet music.
Well, if they are all
But
alone,
they don't necessarily retrieve the whole. Like this is the difference between the conductor that is in the position that has a kind of an extended cognition. Like I have this score, I understand it as a whole. I want to externalize my vision of this work, whatever. So I'm going to rehearse the orchestra so it concretize my vision. So he's in a different position. Whereas the individual musician, violinist, whatever, the guy who plays the triangle that has like three times he plays in a 1 hour piece, like he's in a very high task dependency position, right? He doesn't see the whole at all, or of course, once you rehearse, you see it. But anyway, structurally, his position is just to contribute to a different thing.
Would you say like embedded cognition in the sense that you have low functional integration and also nothing you're doing is really coming from the extended thing? It's kind of just performing like a song on a guitar.
Like a solo, yeah.
Yeah,
something like
whereas,
that.
for example, if you're improvising, where the extension is actually active in storing the relevant things, you might not know what you're going to play until you hear yourself. That's more like high functional integration, even though the tasks are still low, not that dependent, right? In orchestras, it seems like it's highly dependent, but low integration. Things make sense on their own, but you only make sense of their collectiveness if you take them as parts of a whole. And then you can think about something that is actually distributed in the sense here.
Yeah, I have this, the distributed cognition is like this kind of piece where everybody has to know what everybody else is playing. Like, for instance, Maïkoni, Lamontiang's work, like everybody has to know what everybody else is playing, otherwise they will play it wrong.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is the case. I think distributed, because at the same time, you need to know that you need to know a part of it. You don't need to know everything, right?
Yeah.
The difference here is that what makes this difference that the external elements and the other people, they are absolutely constitutive of it. It would never happen without the other parts. And the meaning of your tasks also don't make sense if you're alone. Whereas in the symbiotic, you are not that integrated. Things can be uncoupled and they still make sense, but you highly depend on others to make sense of the tasks. So yeah, I think it's an interesting question here. How would these things play in terms of like musical examples? I'm not sure.
Could you also think about this difference between symbiotic cognition and distributed cognition in political systems? I mean, not political systems, but political bodies. Like, for example, you can have like what's it called? Like a march. When people are marching, you have a high task dependency in the sense that you have many people who are doing many things together, where the sum cannot be. There's a level of coordination that exceeds the individuals, but it can be easily decoupled in the sense that it's a momentary, and then it's like different for example, from a strike, which has to be orchestrated, regulated, and you have to, in a sense, have a high functional integration because the resistance of that strike depends on people doing.
That's very nice. So like protest would go here.
Yeah.
Strike would go here. That's cool.
Like Lula would be extended cognition.
Yeah, so I don't know, there's something here. What I wanted to make sure we cover also is that he says Well, this is a bit complicated because it's weird that things can be uncoupled, right? That like a sign is uncoupled from us. Like I don't need the airport sign in my life all the time to think. I can think most things without the airport sign. It's just, let's say, giving me a content of thought. On the other hand, so it's lowly integrated. It's not really that tightly knit, but I can only make sense of it by looking from another synthetic point of view, right? And then he says that he wants to argue that symbiotic cognition, unlike distributed cognition, invites a centered perspective on cognition. So it's weird because we just said, well, we are parts of a larger whole because high task dependency seems to imply that. And he says that not really, because symbiotic cognition makes sense only from the standpoint of individuals. So the distinction between symbiotic and distributed is seemingly gradual. Yeah, the difference between a distributed perspective on a group mind and a centered perspective on cognition in social institutions is binary. The point is that there is more principal distinction between the two that corresponds with low and high functional integration. Distinction pertains to the purposes or aims of distributed cognitive systems and symbiotic cognitive systems. The purpose of or aim of distributed cognitive system is pitched at the suprapersonal, like moving the vessel, steering a plane, systemic level. That is, the purpose that is served by the system should not be sought at the level of the individuals that co-comprise the system, but at a more zoomed out level. For example, the system comprised of pilots and cockpit equipment as a whole has the purpose of controlling an airplane more or less like a mind controls a body. The purpose or aim of transactional memory system consisting of a married couple consists in storing and retrieving memories together, more or less as done by an individual. By contrast, if we look at the symbiotic cognitive systems, their purposes are pitched at the subsystemic personal level. Educational systems educate individual persons. Legal systems and cultural conventions allow individuals to coordinate in various complex ways. So here you can see him stepping back, right? I mean, he cannot accept that legal systems don't exist to cultivate people's liberties. The purpose that is served by symbiotic systems should be sought at the level of the individuals that co-comprise them. So he makes a distinction there back and saying, he does say adopting a distributed perspective on an educational system is possible. Doing so would require us to spell out the purpose of the system at the suprapersonal system level. The point is that it would be contrived to call such a function cognitive because it does not resemble any paradigmatic cognitive function. So he introduced, like, you remember Gallagher was criticizing Chalmers because, like, when I extend things socially, I just need them to play a cognitive role. They don't need to look like what I call cognition. And then Slors even goes further and says, no, we need to even distinguish these things even further. But then when he needs to claim that a delocalized, right? Because ultimately the distributed system is more localized, right? If you look at things like this, the symbiotic thing, like I added the individual or collective point of view, right? The symbiotic cognition that he's proposing, it's only something external because of organization, not because of physical external things, right? It's the task dependence. This is wrong here, right? I just added it external element, but it's high dependence on the tasks, on the whole, right? It's valid for all of them. Low dependence on the whole. And low integration, right? It's not that integrated, meaning I cannot find the body to which it is the mind. So yes, I can think of it individually or collectively. I can say, yes, I'm part of the social system, of the educational system. But since I cannot find anything that looks like cognition, no metaphor, no analogy with my own cognitive plus body kind of duo, it's better to keep the mind at the individual level, center it on individual cognition and say, the whole, I'm part of the whole, but the whole is ultimately serving my individual purpose. So social organizations are too detached from us. They're too low. They're not that integrated. for its epistemic properties to be called cognitive when seen from the collective perspective. And you can compare this with the other case, which is the distributed cognition case, because they are autonomous enough from us to be analogous to the mind-body relations of control. So like distributed cognition examples are always like a plane and where it's headed. And then you say, this is like the mind, this is like the body. So you're actually going back to the individual cognition metaphor. That's why you can non-problematically call this cognition. Because ultimately you still have the mind body, all the metaphors are the same for thought. The symbiotic one that Slors proposed is the weird one. Because I have a bunch of things going on that exist on their own, that I'm saying that there is some connections that only make sense if you consider all those connections together. But that thing that they make together, it doesn't look like cognition, even though it's extending cognition and it's processing cognitive information. So he doesn't want to call it cognition, it just looks too weird. Whereas, steering a vessel looks much more like, okay, we are controlling together this large chunk of metal, right? So this gets us to the point, we're 2 hours in, I think we can go another half an hour, right? Is that okay?
Yeah, could you go back one slide? I just wanted to point out a nice mapping here. Doesn't these 4 things kind of map to the 4 forms of change in Badiou? If you think about like,
really?
Oh, is that you've already you have a slide for that?
Yes, we have a slide for that.
Okay,
but we're not going to get there. One day perhaps. But yes, I had the similar feel, like in a certain sense. I don't think it's exactly the way, but I had the same impression that there's a connection.
Yeah, because I was just thinking the first one, at least, it's like you're modifying your individual cognition, right? You're by adding like a calculator or some kind of external tool. And the last one, it's like you're not even referring to your individual cognition as the perspective of it changes. So it seems like the move from like modification to strong singularity. Yeah,
it's true. I tried to do something like that, but I did. Now that you're saying it, I realized probably I should have done it in a slightly different way, because you could say that the modified object is the cognitive agent, right? So
yeah,
like you have a cognitive agent, and you have the existence of the agent itself, and you have the inexistent of the agent, right? And then you can say that in some sense, extended cognition puts something which is not you, but is you into play, right? Like embedded cognition already makes your extensive existence, right? You're situated in an environment. It already makes it count, right? And extended cognition is saying that, things which are do not exist as you, they don't have a value of existence identical to you, right? They are part of you. But still the object remains constant, right? So you're still a cognitive agent, but something which was outside of you is now more identical to you than before. Right?
Yeah. I'm having trouble. What is the inexistent in this case?
Yeah, that's what I wanted to propose. For the examples I just gave, that's not relevant, but I think it becomes as we go, because let's just introduce the problem, which has to do exactly what you're saying. So, right. So this is kind of the idea for these general schemas we just saw. All of them, with the exception of the original one, which was just that substitutive one, they imply that if you extend some processes through some external system, you can arrive at some information that is different from this information you would get simply by trying to work through the thing with your own cognitive capacities, right? So there are some questions here. How do we think about the relation between these problem spaces? and these external aid systems, right? And how do we singularize these things? Because we want to think about mediations as being different. We don't want to think all mediations as being the same. So why as external system 1 and not external system 2, right? And this is kind of the justification for going into the surrogate reasoning theory. For example, this is the sort of problem that these guys are trying to answer. So for example, this is Shimojima's thesis. He says, look at a Venn diagram, right? That is stating that there are no B's that are not A's, right? Everything that is B is here. There is nothing in B, which is not also in A. This is one way of stating it. An Euler diagram, right? Everything that is B is inside of everything that is A. It's stating the same information, but there are two modes of representing the information. And they're trying to understand what constitutes the difference in modes of representation. Why for some information, some problems, some modes of representation are more appropriate than others. And by representation, he says right off the bat, the first page of this thesis, that he's not talking about so-called mental representations. For him, representations are things in the world that stand in for other things in the world. So in no moment are we talking about internal states of affairs. So it's always connections between parts of the world, okay? So for example, this is a representation of a logical syllogism. I could write the logical syllogism here, and this would be a representation of it. And this would be another representation. And the question is, can we distinguish these things? What would distinguish them, right? And this is the core of the surrogate reasoning project, which is this hypothesis here. They call it the constraint hypothesis. The claim is representations are objects in the world, and as such, they obey certain structural constraints that govern their possible formation. So you have a representation. It is, because it is in the world, it is constrained structurally, just as the thing you're representing is constrained, right? So you're picturing a ball, like there is a real ball here on a table, and you want to draw a picture of a ball, right? It's representing this thing here. But just as this thing here has, gravity acting upon it, it's constrained in time and space. If I make a point here, if I make a line to be my table, and I drew another line like this, they will cross in one point. That's a structural constraint of a visual 2D paper. So the representations are also structurally constrained. And then the big claim is that the variance in inferential potential of different modes of representation is largely attributable to different ways in which the structural constraints on representations match with the constraints on targets of representation. So it's a really cool kind of materialist state where, let's say I have a representational system 1 and 2. Well, this is a piece of paper, so it's constrained by geometry, by physics, some way, blah, blah, blah. And this is a piece of paper where I'm going to narrate the same system here, right? So I'm picturing it as an image, or I'm narrating it in a like written text. Here I have grammar rules. I also have ink, whatever, but it's definitely different constraints than these ones, right? They are stemming from both conventional, but also material aspects of the systems. And what they want to claim is that this added thing we want to understand, right? It's the first idea of explaining some novelty. Like, where does this novel thing come from? Because this is new. I couldn't have gotten to this by myself. I had to extend it to this. So why did this allow me to add this difference to my understanding, right? Which I didn't have before. So the constraint hypothesis says that the material basis of these systems is largely responsible for what allows us to generate information that we couldn't otherwise. Does this make sense? Not only is it cool, but does it make sense? So the the example that they give, everyone gives examples with old people having difficulties. The example that Shimojima gives is Harry trying to describe geographical features of the village in which he grew up by memory. You can see how close we are to the whole topic of extended mind and so on. So after trying to recollect by himself, he decides to draw the approximate map of his hometown. Based on the fragments of his memory, he draws line curves on a sheet of paper. It's pretty much this drawing here, right? And then, this is the point, he recollects one more piece of information, which he calls, how do we call this little symbol, guys? Is this phi, sigma? What is this?
Theta.
Theta, thanks. I never know these things. Really terrible with it. So theta 1 states that the house K is halfway between the houses L and M. So if you look at the previous drawing, there was no house here, right? He drew the house here. But the point is that, so he puts a wood block standing for the house K between the wood blocks standing for houses L and M. As the result of this simple operation, Harry's map now presents many new pieces of information other than the original piece that he added, that were absent from the initial map. For example, the house K was across house F. It's constrained to be the case due to the visual space of the representation, right? Because if I locate a point, I'm also locating it with regards to everything around it, because that's how space works. We're borrowing the constraints of space to further constrain our thoughts. So we learn things we didn't know. We only knew this. The house is halfway between L and M. But now we know that it's also across house F over the river. It's closer to the road 1 than house M was. That house M is closer to the bridge S. That house K and the house A have this road through them. Like, all these pieces of information were not there originally. You're allowed to extract them because the representation has certain constraints, which are spatial constraints. Now you can say, no, this is always the case. This is like a priori syntactic shit. Like, yes, if I am here, therefore you're there, and we are in relations, because that's what the concept includes. Yeah, but think that Harry was trying to write this down, like at a narrative. And he just wrote the statement, the house K is halfway between houses L and M. He can write anything he wants after that. Nothing constrains him but the English language. So the means of organizing these things, which is now a narrative text, it has less constraints on what he can say next. And therefore, it's not really pushing him towards some information rather than other. So what they want to explain is this sort of thing. How can different material structures, material constraints determine, or at least partially determine, the capacity of a system to represent new information or to solve a problem and so on. So this is the crazy, I mean, kind of crazy. It's kind of quite intuitive when you think about it. This is the way that they formalize this thing. So they have like logicians, they do like everything. It's very, very simplified, like step by step, but it's very easy to understand. So you have a target, meaning the thing being represented, which is a set T, which states T, and information theta about it. So for every state of affairs in a world, there is some information concerning it. For example, yes, if you lived in this place, there's some stuff some information about it, like your house was on this side of the river, it wasn't, so on, right? You have a surrogate domain S, which has its own states of affairs, like the page is empty, I drew a house. Those are different moments of the drawing. And it has some sigma information. Sigma 1, sigma 2, meaning I drew something here on the page. I drew something next to what I drew, right? At first, you can think of these two things as separate systems, which have some states and have some information about what is in them, not about semantic representation or nothing like that, right? And they have their own constraints. So there are specific constraints to real world architecture, urban, geographical situations. And there are different constraints to visual spaces in a piece of paper, right? Then they add information links, which is things that signal that your one situation in the piece of paper has to do with one real state of affairs. For example, I'm drawing this thing, it's a house, right? And there are the informations I can extract from my drawings and how they link up with informations about the real world, which is this other arrow here. Two information links, like this state of affairs refers to that real world state, that represented state of affairs, and this information refers to that information about the state of affairs. Then they add some other things, which is the space of action on S, because you cannot manipulate, right? Harry cannot manipulate houses, but he can manipulate his surrogate drawing. So there are actions he can do on the drawing. He can draw something, he can move from one state of affairs to another, right? And there are types of actions he can make, like to draw something, to erase something, to cross over something, to paint something, right? They add a method for action filtering, which is giving what is meaningful about a situation, which is the information in the world. There are some actions that are relevant. So you're looking for where is a house. So where you draw things will be relevant. So that's your method. It could change. It's like a normative principle. And then you have constraints, which are for him, you can see he doesn't even define it differently on targets and surrogates. He just says constraints have domains and the constraints which say from this state, only some follow, others don't follow. So if I draw something like this and I draw something on top, so, and I draw something else, either it will be like this, or it will be like this, or it will be like this, or like this. There are no other possibilities. Either they're totally disjunct, they touch in one point, they touch on 2 points, or one is inside the other. There's no other option, right? Yeah, it looks a lot like Rosen. Exactly. And then they call the reasoning system in total this thing. If you have a target, a surrogate, rules of semantic relation, right? How to relate information with information, action space, and a method for filtering your actions based on the systems at play. You have a reasoning system, which is relating to things separately in the world. So I think this is enough for. So yeah, pretty much I could have shown you guys this thing would be easier. So he shows two things we can learn from this. The first is the idea of free rides, which we already saw, which is the case where Harry just put one information, which is my house is between those two houses, and he got a bunch of information for free, right? The other example he gives is a student uses a Venn diagram to check the validity of a syllogism. A free ride is the case where I change a state to another state. For example, I do a drawing. My action is to draw another house in my drawing. So I added this other information. And the constraints on the surrogate system give me this added information. And I can then go and verify that because these constraints have something to do with these constraints, these are visual constraints on bidimensional space. And I'm also slicing real geography in a bidimensional sense where plane geometry works. So this free information actually is real information about the real world target that I'm interested in. So I got that information for free, right? Yeah. So
I have a question.
Sure.
Like thinking about the other stuff we were talking about. I wrote it down just so I couldn't forget it. So like when there is when it's valid, the linking of constraints, do we say that it's like a high? Can we say that it's either can it be categorized as high functional dependency or high functional integration, or task dependency? Is that something
I
that?
don't know how to do it in that case, because the way that I'm organizing these two parts of the research is think about task dependency and functional integration as the question, how are things composed? Is it like something that only exists because I'm mixing myself with something external? Does it exist even if you're uncoupled? Is it something that only is intelligible from the perspective of the whole, or is it intelligible from my cognition? So it's more a matter of how is the surrogate system composed and how we relate to it. This here is more about how can you produce a difference? How can a surrogate system say more than what I can say? So we're trying to answer a slightly different question. I think that your question, in my opinion, it's how we unpack these things later on.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, because if it's because the notebook I'm extending my mind on, it's similar in its constraints to memory, to long-term memory. You can write something there, you can update it, you can retrieve it, right? Those properties that Clark was talking about in Chalmers, easy access, you believe it once you read it, it's stored, and you can, those things. So it's because those constraints are similar, and because more specifically you're accessing, no, in that case it wasn't the case, it wasn't a map, right? So yes, it was similar to memory in a certain sense. It's constrained like memory, or it's in the case of a map, Harry's map, is constrained in a similar way to the space you want to go to, right? So when you get to social questions, it becomes interesting, because what are interesting constraints that will get you more information about the world that you wouldn't get on your own? And then how you compose into larger stuff starts to be like an interesting answer, right? So it's in that direction, but I don't know how I would, with this diagram, locate those concepts, right? Probably they unpack these things, I guess.
Yeah, I was just thinking that, because it seems that, like, if you have the newer the information, or the more different the information you have than you would have without the surrogate reasoning, it seems that there is a higher functional integration that is happening there. Because
the more different it is from what you would learn without it.
Yeah. But as we've seen, you can have higher functional integration with lower and higher task dependency.
Yeah, for example, I agree with you, like calculators seem to be the case, right? For example, the calculator is a system where my action is to write a sum. I just know how to write, the numbers I'm using and press some buttons, and it would give me some information that is something I could not access. But if you ask me, what are these functions? I can describe all of them. Like, they're low task dependent. I know all of them, like, from my own perspective, but they're highly functionally integrated in the sense that I just used something. The actions on the surrogate system are just actions of just handle it, right? And you get the new information. Whereas in the case of symbiotic cognition, you don't use the legal system to get the information. Like, that's not the sort of information we're talking about. We're interested in ways of learning new information about the social world. So it's not really like a calculator. So
yeah,
the task dependency seems to be high. You want to say things you can only say because they're organized, right? So slightly different. So I'm not sure how to translate this thing. So probably, let's say, the type of actions change. If you look at this thing here, perhaps this is how I would go about it. I would probably connect here to task dependency, right? The method is the normative part. And perhaps the functional integration has to do with what sort of action, like, and the type of constraint, if it's material. I don't know. It's something to think about. I'm a bit confused how to, like, connect the two things, But just to make sure we go over this other thing, he says, well, with the same system, we can also explain the inverse case, which is over specificity. So for example, imagine that Harry, after he puts the block, right, K between the block L and the M, which gave him that other information, he remembers that there is this other house B that is somewhere between house A and K. So between A and K, there are many places you could put the house B, right? And he wants to represent this information in his map by placing the block between A and K. But you know, spatial constraints say that you cannot put something so indeterminately in space. You need to put it here or there. But if he puts here or there, it will follow information that is not true necessarily. Because if he puts it, let's say, near L, he will also be saying all those other free ride things, which he cannot confirm. If he puts it before L, he might be saying other things he doesn't know if he can confirm, right? Compare it with if he was just writing in a piece of paper. Nothing would follow, right? Because you can just state in a piece of paper, I know house B is between A and K. It's too isolated. Like, language doesn't require you to imply anything else, right? So if he were to write this information that he has, which is real information, it's between this and that, if he were to write it in the piece of paper, he would also write things he doesn't believe, or they're not true. He cannot prove they're true. They're not constrained to be true, right? So if he writes something in one place, he will get one information. If he writes in another place, which is equally true according to his statement, he will get some other information. But both of them give semantic meanings which are incompatible. So it's a sort of over specificity of the surrogate system. It requires you to say too much more than you want to say, right? And then they tell us, look, there are many ways in which we can benefit or get damaged by surrogate system. They say that, well, constraints seem to be the thing that generates new information, but there are different types of constraints. And they say, well, you can project constraints on your information through the medium, the very medium of your surrogate system. It's a case when we cannot present some information in the system without also presenting some other information. But for material reasons, or structural reasons, this is what we call the nomic constraints, like a natural or structural one. It's not due to convention. Like, it doesn't matter if you want two lines to interact in a piece of paper. They interact because of spatial structural reasons, right? Whereas if I say something like line 1 and line 2, and I invent a symbol for intersection, I'm not materially constrained to write this. I'm symbolically constrained by a grammar. So it's different. So he calls this conventional constraint. It has to do with how you decide to represent things, right, normatively. And then there are constraints by action, which is, let's say, to do some actions, you need to decompose it in certain steps. Since that's the only way to do it, the action is constraining your representation as well. Like, if you can only draw a perpendicular line by first drawing, you know, those things like this with a compass to make sure, you get some added information, which is coming because of the way in which you draw the other line. So it's coming from the action. So the medium, the action, and the normative method can all pass on constraints to your surrogate system. And I love the fact that with this, he pretty much comes to a distinction between language and other forms of representation. And he says diagrammatic modes for him are everything which is not linguistic versus linguistic representation. And he says all diagrammatic representation systems project non-trivial nomic constraints. So he says in every system of representation, which is not language, the material medium constrains what you can do. Whereas in linguistic systems, that's not the case. The connection between phonemes and the constraints of language are not direct. Like, if you make a certain sound with your voice, you cannot make another sound. That's not constraining the information in language very much. Whereas if I draw something here and I want to draw something else and I only have a line, well, there are only 3 types of places I can put is a nomic constraint, it's structural, right? Whereas if I say something like, so this is point A, and if I want to point B, I can only put it in these 3 places, right? Whereas if I write something like point A, point A is in the middle. And then I write point B is left and point B is right. I can write both things. Nothing constrains me not to, right? So for him, you can distinguish between linguistic representation and this sort of other types of representations by the role that these material constraints play on generativity of information. Which is pretty cool, because if you go back to our whole Badiou thing, Badiou's whole point is that language cannot extract anything from being, right? It can only divide being. So you can kind of name things they're already apart, but you need this sort of generic procedure which literally extracts new constraints out of material sets to be able to acquire new information about a situation, right? So just to recapitulate, we can end here. I will leave the speculative stuff for later. Like, I think it's good to make sure we have this distinction in mind between these extended processes that just are substitutive from extended processes which are constitutive of new things, right? This brings to the picture this issue of, okay, but where is this difference coming from? How is it that the external thing is able to produce this difference? And the answer that the surrogacy procedure is trying to give, the surrogacy theory, is the constraint hypothesis, right? It's claiming that improved reasoning through surrogacy relies on free rides afforded by the structure of the mediating system. So how you're structured as a mediation is the main cause as to why you're able to generate information that directly you couldn't, right? So it's connecting this and these constraints here, right? It's constraining with not the symbolic ones, but the nomic ones, right? The non-trivial nomic ones, the ones that come from the material dimension, not the symbolic conventions, right?
Yeah, so you're saying the site is a nomic.
Yes.
It's a site of nomic differences.
Yes. And I mean, they come to this idea that ultimately material organization has a power of improving cognition, right? Diagrammatic systems carry material constraints, while linguistic ones only have conventional ones. Linguistics are more flexible, more expressive, but less generative. Diagrammatic tend to be more contrived, more kind of poorer even, but at the same time more generative, right? And symbolic systems that try to mimic material constraints, like formal languages, which are really tightly deductive, even though they are symbolic, they are the ones that reproduce this material quality the most. I think you could take this theory very far and show that ultimately symbolic formal mathematical languages are, let's say, attempts to abstract these material models, but they come first, you know? They're just trying to mimic a nomic constraint within a symbolic constraint. Which makes sense with Badiou, if you think about it, why mathematics would be what it is. The purest discourse of no material basis, right?
It reminds me. Yeah, no, I don't know if the parallel is good actually, but just remind me a bit of in model theory how you have the sort of like structure you're trying to study and the sort of logical language you have, and then you're trying to, you have implication on one side, and then you have the sort of like algebra that governs the mathematical structure, and then the logical language is trying to track and sort of express stuff that the feeling is a bit that the model is, which is the model is the material thing you're talking about, and then language is on the logical side, right?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, you know, Shimojima, he says explicitly, like, Barwise tried to do, he went very far, but just to try to explain natural language and language situations, so on. I want a theory of modeling that is non-linguistic, like doesn't have a commitment to the idea that language is a linguistic thing. In the sense that you could talk about, again, in these situations, you could have the target system be, you know, a piece of land, and the surrogate system be a piece of paper. And those are the things you're connecting, right? So this is the representation. It doesn't need to be a logical language that is abstract, right? So, but I think honestly, I think it's very similar. And then I just wanted to end, like, since we're already closing, I like this because you can see what happens when you cannot make a more materialist theory of where new information comes from. This is Clark, who's clearly, you know, amazing. And in his economic reason, he ends with this discussion of, okay, how do we individually learn through the scaffolding social structures and so on? How can this improve or relate to our cognition? And his theory is that, well, there are two factors that conspire to enable us to rise above this basic computational route that he's talking about. Like, you predict with a margin of error, then you try again, and so on. And he says, well, the first is our old friend external scaffolding, meaning you can displace to these social institutions, these external things, a lot of the cognitive costs of doing things. So you are able to expand, right? And this says the second involves a more tendentious idea, namely that we are internally driven to reorganize our knowledge continually in purely exploratory ways. So he says, like, a lot of like leaps in learning can be explained by gradient descent learning. Like, it looks from the outside like it's continuous, but actually the model can be learning in discontinuous ways. So a lot of leaps actually can be explained by just continuously applying this sort of more algorithmic description. But then he says, but this may not exhaust the tricks in the canny human cognizer. One conjecture is called representational redescription. The conjecture is that human learning incorporates an endogenous drive to go beyond success. He pretty much is rediscovering the death drive in Freud. We're endogenously driven to go beyond success, like clearly like goes off the map. It says, imagine a being who has achieved a good working solution to a specific problem. If that being were a standard connectionist network, no further learning would occur. Like, you have a good model to interact with your environment. The error margin is very low. So in the absence of error messages, the learning algorithm remains effectively inert. But if that being were a redescriber, she would take the absence of error as a signal to seek reorganizations of her knowledge, reorganizations that might permit greater control or involve integrating disability knowledge with other aspects of her skill and understanding. So the idea, which I like very much, which is there is something about novelty, that hard novelty, the discontinuous novelty, that he associates with reorganization. But since he cannot find anything in the world to be the source of new constraints, he needs to claim there is an endogenous drive in the individual cognizer to always go beyond success, where clearly we're a bunch of lazy folks. So it's a hard, I mean, he gives some studies that show that this exists, which is almost I think it would be a nicer way to put it from the text that I wrote, which is when there is no margin of error, that counts as a margin of error of a different order. And you feel like, well, if I no longer have the error signal to serve as a reality test, it's better to redescribe everything so that there is a new margin of error in my model. So like, it's better to miss the mark by a little than to hit it completely and no longer have the means to know, you know, if that's the best way. So having that little wrong thing in your cognition is actually a good thing. But it's still, there's some leaps that seem that, you know, with a bit of a change to this, we could Badiouianize the whole thing and actually give the cognitive Badiou that we want so much, you know. Exactly. So exactly, they're rediscovering Marx and Freud. So I'm not going to go into this because I think we need to work on this together. But I wanted to show that the way Badiou describes the theory of change, it actually can be redescribed as how much of the constraint is already in the concept of the object and how much of the constraint is in the material that is challenging the concept of the object, right? So modifications in an object concern modifications that are perfectly included in the concept I already have. So an ice cube melts, that's part of being an ice cube, right? Objective facts is the case where you already need something more than the concept, which is an indexical, which refers to a specific fact, to properly name the constraint, because it's already not in the concept. It's in the concept plus the extension, right? So this ice cube melts in this way. Weak singularity is when this thing beyond the concept, it's more important, it's more determining than the concept of the object. So this thing that does this thing in this little way, this is what matters for the constraint, even though the concept is an ice cube, but that doesn't matter. But I can't really propagate those constraints. It doesn't have a name, it doesn't have a rule, right? And strong singularity is when you're able to extract a new type of determination from the object that actually gets to change the name of the object, right? It's changes what the object looks like, changes the concept of the object. So for example, if the ice cube becomes testing ground for, you know, friction studies with phase changing liquids or whatever, like it's a new object. It's no longer an ice cube with the relevant properties or other things. You wouldn't even call it an ice cube probably, and so on. So you're extracting constraints that were in the material, and now they are the main ones, right? That drive further information. So we can actually use this here to untangle the constraint theory of surrogate reasoning to say that perhaps if you probe into things that only count as matter in a situation, you can extract a constraint that has free rides about the situation that we didn't have before. Anyway, I was going to, but this is too much. I think it's already crazy shit.
Can you go quickly back to the...
Sorry, what?
I was curious about the previous slide.
Oh, does it allow me to? Sorry, the previous one. This one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking like regular. So when you just mention the concept of something to make a connection between a target and your surrogates, but it's just the concept of the surrogate. So it's like something in the situation is like that concept. Nothing real matters, but it's just a connection, like almost a metaphoric connection, right? Like Juliet is like the sun. You're not getting any free rides. Like, well, the sun has a lot of helium and a nuclear, you know, fusion core, whatever, like Juliet. No, you don't get that free ride of an information. It's only valid there because it's just a vague kind of thing. When the extension and the actual extensional constraints of the object start to come into play, you get into regular modeling through surrogates. Then I came up with this weird one, which is when you lack a concept in the surrogate. The surrogate includes things you don't know, but that's part of what you want to name about the target, right? So when you say something like this situation, like Edmund Burke talking about French Revolution, it's like volcano. He doesn't know anything about volcanoes. And that's what he wants to say about the French Revolution, right? He's adding the free ride is being able to state an unknown, not being able to state a known, right? And then the price, the trophy of the process, which is generic surrogacy, is when you're extracting constraints from below the site and getting free ride information about the situation from that point of view, right? That would be kind of the idea.
So the metaphor is when it's a sort of not generic, but a general model of something.
Think like this. What are the constraints of the concept? It's just the attributes of the concept.
Yeah.
So the only constraints are like, a red ball is red. So when you say my nose is like a red ball, you compare the real thing, like one nose, to the properties of a red ball, and what follows are just attributes of the concept, totally abstract, right? You won't get any free rides, because I think we're actually doing the Kant thing here, right? About analytics. I didn't want to say anything, but kind of.
And the fact is the sort of like grounding the when you index your concept into like an empirical situation, you're just like mapping into some like situation.
Yeah, but for example, if I say your nose is like a specific red ball, the red ball is interacting with gravity, it's dented in a bit, in a place, it's being kicked around. There are a lot of constraints in the existence of the ball that now I can see if they match up with the thing I'm comparing to, right? Like the moment you situate, so you have a fact, right? Like the thing is situated in the world, it follows a bunch more things than just from the concept, right?
But it's a fact in as much it matches the concept you had. What doesn't match is, from the point of view of a fact, is just noise, right? It's thrown away. The weak singularity is when you have some mechanism that you say, well, that's not just what I expected by the concept I have, but I don't have a name for that. It's just, and it's not noise, it's something else.
But you cannot extract anything from it, right? The best you can get is like the statement of a negative, right? Like it is not what it looks like. It's not about the ice cube. It's about this thing it's doing. I cannot tell what it is.
It's more mystical.
It's more mystical. That's what I really like, that, you know, the mystical is the before last moment. Like it's very Buddhist thing, you know, when you think you reached nirvana, that's when you're really fucked, and then you need to go a bit more. And then strong singularity becomes actually the most ordinary kind of thing, where there are material constraints on mediums which are there but are not part of the concept of those mediums, right? So for example, a sculpture might use ice in a way that is not really directed by any of the attributes of ice, or it's finding an attribute we didn't think of and actually guiding a bunch of decisions based on that constraint, right? Which didn't mean anything. So for example, when we say like cooperation between workers in a certain weird way that doesn't really fit the value form and so on, we might be talking about a constraint on action that is coming from within a site. It's not part of reasoning or institutional reasoning in society. And it can serve as the basis for generating free rides, meaning it adds information to us that we didn't think of, but now is accessible. That's pretty much what we want to get to be able to formally claim, right, that there is a kind of a material version of forcing for surrogate reasoning. Anyway, I'm gonna send you guys these slides. We can try to perhaps.
Do you think Amsterdam from The Wire could be considered in this sense?
Yes, I think definitely. Perfect.
Because
right? I mean, it's a small mediation where he tries something, but you learn something there you wouldn't learn by having the conceptual discussion over drug legalization. So you get new knowledge you wouldn't get there, right? But it's in a small part of the world that just have the right constraints. It's a great example. Yeah. All in The Wire at the end of the day.
Yes, I think if even this is in The Wire, then we are set.
Yeah, and then what I had, it's not the rest is just kind of not really much. It's like just trying to show that we can now go back to that initial diagram and start actually naming things and explaining why differences appear in paths, right? Anyway, guys, thank you so much for lasting this long. I know Renzo must be destroyed at this point, like it's very late.
The time zone changed again, so it's
Okay. It's less
No, it
worse
got-
now.
it got worse.
No.
Yeah,
Damn.
Oh,
What
man,
time
I'm
is
so-
it there? Like 3 a.m.?
2 a.m. So it's
Oh man, I'm so sorry.
no.